Welcome to the weekly report. It's April 15. I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined again today by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie. Yeah.
In this week's weekly report, 240 Ford workers are the latest victims of Australia's great economy. The government gives big bikkies to the climate change hoax, but peanuts for real science. And Julia Gillard is British L-A-B-O-U-R, not Australian L-A-B-O-R. So, 240 Ford workers are the latest victims of Australia's great economy. This week, Ford Australia has announced it's going to be sacking 240 workers in its Broadmeadows and its Geelong plants. This is the latest toll on the car industry in Australia, the once great car industry in Australia, which has been systematically destroyed by British free trade, the policy that our government has fanatically pursued, even under the current Labor government and in the face of the global financial crisis. They have just callously said they're going to push ahead with free trade and impose more and more tariff cuts on the car industry. As a consequence of the government's free trade policy, car production in Australia has been in free fall. I'll give you some figures on that. In 2003, whereas we produced 408,186 cars, last year, 2010, we produced 239,443 cars. The only support that the government offers the car industry is quote-unquote innovation, coming up with scams such as new green cars, which they then didn't end up funding anyway. And consequently, this industry is in decline. Craig, these are not just normal job losses, are they? What really is at stake here?
Well, Robbie, what's at stake here is the future in the sense of being able to rebuild our country, because the car industry represents one of the last bastions of our machine tool capability. Now, to build a car, you need machines that are very sophisticated to do that. Well, if you lose the car industry, you lose those machines and that capability. But this is, again, the fraud of globalisation of free trade, as you're saying. And as our government throws our car manufacturers to the wolves of globalisation, we are going to suffer greatly, and this is just the tip of the iceberg of what is going to take place. It's understood in a globalised market, any one manufacturer has to produce approximately 250,000 cars. That's just one manufacturer. Now here in Australia, as you just said, we produce 239,000 cars thereabouts amongst the 3 remaining manufacturers. There used to be 5, now there's 3. So how are these manufacturers supposed to survive in a globalised world when that's in fact what's expected? So what you have also, unfortunately, these days, and it's the same in many countries around the world, you've had this reliance on cars as a mode of transport. And because of that, much of the other infrastructure that we need in this country has never been built. So the solution is what we've put forward many times in our publications, is that we have to move away from petroleum-based car transport and actually have a much more efficient mass transportation system within the cities, but also to deal with the tyranny of distance, to build high-speed, very high-speed, magnetic levitation train systems that can actually break the backbone of the tyranny of distance in our country. Now, if we were to have such an industry, where would it be centred? Well, the obvious place is to retool the car industry or those car manufacturing plants and say, let's build the rolling stock, let's build the necessary engines infrastructure to build the magnetic levitation trains. But if you get rid of the car industry, if you just allow it to die under globalisation, you lose that capacity for the future. So it's a big issue, but it's a continuing issue. It's been going on for a long time. We really do have to save our machine tool capacity. The way to do that is to move away from cars keep some of it, protect the industry that we have, bring back the tariffs so that we can have some basic car production. The car market in Australia is 1 million cars per year, right? But only of those, only about 230,000 represent domestic sales and production. So we have to move away from that, get into real rail-based mass transit systems. We can do that, and that's the direction that we have to go.
And we'll need the skills represented in the car industry to be able to pull off that transition.
That's right, yeah.
All right. Secondly, the federal government gives big bickies to the climate change hoax, but peanuts for real science. This week, we've seen medical researchers in Australia take to the streets, people who normally spend their time looking down microscopes at cultures, but they've taken to the streets in large numbers to protest the $400 million that has been mooted will be cut from the health research budget by the Gillard government. Now, the Gillard government is leaking out this information in anticipation for the federal budget that'll be unveiled in the next few weeks. It highlights a very disturbing fact about the way the government runs its policy in this area. And the obvious contrast to these massive budget cuts for health research, the benefits of which are obvious, is the amount of money the government splurges on a hoax, climate change, but a hoax that's designed to kill people. As we've said repeatedly, the effect of what they're telling us will have to be done in order to supposedly solve climate change, stop climate change, is cuts in energy consumption by the people of Australia, which will immiserate people, produce mass poverty, and condemn people to early deaths through diseases of poverty. That's what will happen, and that's what climate change is promoting. The government spends billions on that, literally billions of dollars. They are cutting funds, by contrast, on areas of science that actually do benefit people. So like I said, medical research is obvious. Another one that is just as obvious now in the context of what we've been talking about here in recent times is the scientific research into things like earthquake precursors. So we know from the Japanese earthquake and tsunami example that these things, the power of nature when it comes to earthquakes is deadly. Tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people can be killed in a very short time, a matter of minutes and hours. It turns out that there are scientists who are working hard at the science of predicting such events, which if we can get it down to a fine art, will give us early warning systems that will enable people to be taken out of harm's way. So the benefits of that are obvious. But the work that we've featured on our website and on the LaRouche PAC website of people like Pier Francesco Biaggi in Italy, he points out that the one way to make sure you don't get funded is to say you want funding for things such as earthquake precursors. So this is an example where government funding policy deliberately suppresses this kind of science. We've highlighted here how Barack Obama, a fellow traveller of Julia Gillard in these matters, he just flat out states, you can't control earthquakes, you can't predict earthquakes, and his government is madly gutting the resources of a very important organisation such as NASA, which if we're going to perfect it, will have to lead on this. What is the Australian government doing in this area? From what we can tell, absolutely nothing. There are places such as Queensland where our earthquake monitoring facilities have been shut down over the last decade or so. So that is the contrast in when it comes down to the funding of science. Craig, you issued a statement on this today. How should Australians see this funding issue?
Well, when you look at this budget discussion that's going on right now with the Gillard government, what I see is that she's funding our extinction as human beings. I mean, just look at the medical research debate, right? Cut that. That's going to kill people, right? But it's even more dangerous than that. And I think this is the point that Mr. LaRouche has made in on his weekly reports on his website, that when you look at this discussion or this so-called debate about climate change is a complete fraud. And when you look at what's happened with the earthquakes recently in Japan, you can just see the enormous amounts of energy that are involved when the plates shift. But we just don't know what causes these earthquakes. Now, when you go and have a look on the LaRouche PAC site, which I've done a lot of lately because of the incredible amount of material in there, you actually make a discovery for yourself of just what an utter fraud this global climate, this man-made climate change is. Because what you see is the scale of the forces that we, as human beings, have to tolerate on the face of the globe. And we see the destruction, as you mentioned, a couple of 100,000 people that were killed in the Sumatra earthquake and the tens of thousands that were killed in the Japanese earthquake. These are the sorts of forces that mankind are literally put up against. So when you go and have a look and you start to study, well, okay, our Earth sits in a solar system, in a galaxy, you say, well, what are these forces? And then you look at this big ball of energy called the sun, which is throwing out enormous amounts of cosmic solar radiation. Then you start to look at the biosphere, and it's made up of things like the magnetosphere, the electrosphere, right? And you have all sorts of different dynamics inside of that. And then you start to look at the climate change debate on anthropogenic global warming, and you realise that most people don't have a clue about how the actual biosphere functions. And you realise that the forces are so great that there's nothing that man could do. Not even the nuclear weapons that we have today compare in terms of the power to the forces that are unleashed on the surface of the Earth in these terms of earthquakes. Now, one of the dangers is that if we keep allowing these natural disasters to wipe out tens of thousands of human beings, what if there's even bigger disasters further down the track in our galaxy? Now, our Earth is part of the solar system, is moving through the galaxy and is subject to increasing and decreasing cosmic rays, right? And these cosmic rays, we don't know how they impinge and affect the Earth. We actually don't know very, very little about it. When you have this debate taking place around earthquakes, you just see how much we don't know. Now, for example, the interesting material coming up lately about the Japan earthquake is that an Italian professor, Francisco Biaggi, actually forecast this 10 days in advance. He let the authorities know, but there was no interest in the authorities because they don't, as you said before, they don't believe that you can forecast these things, right? He's an Italian seismologist, and he did that.
It's convenient for them not to believe that, obviously.
Well, that's right, okay? Because then that also brings into effect this fraud on climate change. The other thing is that there was a Russian scientist recently at a very large conference in Europe who put forward and demonstrated how earthquakes can be actually forecast. That there are certain known precursors that can be actually measured, and you can then foresee when the potential for a new earthquake happens. So when you look at what Julia Gillard's doing in funding the billions of dollars in this fraud of global warming, as opposed where just a few $1 million can set up governments, can set up our government to read the existing instrumentation that's already available according to the Russian scientist Sergei Pulinets, then you start to realise, well, she really doesn't care about humanity. She's not concerned about the fact that our human race is actually very vulnerable to the massive forces that our planet finds itself within space. So consequently, we need to be involved in this urgent research program, and we should be getting on the ground floor. And then when you look at actually where we sit in the universe, in the galaxy, you realise just how fraudulent all this discussion is that Julia Gillard's going on about.
I have to take you up on one thing, though. You said that she seems to be committed to extinction, our extinction. Now, is that hyperbole, or as she would say, hyperbole, or are you being serious when you say that about her?
I'm absolutely serious, because the problem is, Robbie, our Earth is now moving into a new phase of its existence in geological time. What we're moving into is the end of a 62 million year cycle where our Earth is moving out of the plane of the galaxy as part of the solar system, and consequently we're becoming more exposed to cosmic radiation. There's also measurements going on right now and we don't know whether this is the cause of the cosmic radiation increasing or decreasing, but they're measuring decreases in the geomagnetic sphere around the Earth, which is also reported to be a precursor for what's called a pole shift. Now, if that geomagnetic sphere decreases in its intensity, that means that we end up getting hit by more and more cosmic radiation. And we're pretty fragile human beings. So you start to look at what the real science is saying, that is actually paying attention to what our universe is actually doing, as opposed to believing this politically motivated climate change rubbish. And you say, holy heck, if we don't start to look at this, the human race could be extinct.
So this science is not buried. I mean, you know, it hasn't taken us long to get a picture of this. So when you've got governments such as Gillard's that, in their own words, have a stated commitment to sustainable population, you really see how it's convenient for them to ignore real threats such as this, because they don't care if there are mass deaths of the population. It fits in with their philosophy.
That's right. And they're only concerned about getting caught promoting those sorts of policies. I mean, there's plenty of scientists around in Australia today that don't believe in global warming caused by mankind. Where are they? They don't get the voice, because the media is controlled. The mass media is controlled through the Murdoch and Packer type networks. And also, look, the enormous amount of funding that goes in to propagate these political motivated lies like global warming. You don't hear those voices, right? Because it's just a fraud.
All right, finally, while we're on our theme about Julia Gillard, Julia Gillard is British Labour, not Australian Labor. On Wednesday night this week, Margaret Thatcher gave a chilling speech to the Sydney Institute in which she declared her intention to force pensioners into low-wage jobs. Oh, wait, it was Julia Gillard. This is a shocking reality that's starting to emerge the longer Julia Gillard is our Prime Minister and gets the attention that she deserves. She is showing herself to be the exact opposite of what the Australian Labor Party founded itself on. In fact, she's showing herself to be a cross between Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, that is a Fabian Society fascist. And by fascist, I mean actual fascist, an adherent to the economic policies of fascism from the 1930s, also known as the corporativist state, in which financial powers, the bankers, etc., dictated how the economy was run, including dictated the forced reduction of living standards of the people in order to prop up the banks. That's what fascism was. And in this global financial crisis that is deepening every day now, Julia Gillard is running a government that is not solving the crisis through implementing policies such as a Glass-Steagall and putting the banks through reorganisation, but is instead at every turn slashing government funding to important areas of the economy, and now they've turned their guns onto the big one, which is the important welfare safety net in Australia. This is not surprising. Not only is Julia Gillard a POM herself, but she is a Fabian. She's a member of the Fabian Society, a proud member of the Fabian Society. She draws her political ideas through her advisors who come from a think tank in England that Tony Blair set up called the Demos think tank, which is a Fabian Society think tank. And so this is the kind of think tank that comes up with these schemes such as welfare to work, etc., which is just all about this kind of brutal austerity on people. The consequence of this can be nothing but misery. She will slash Australia's welfare bill, which is the intention, by forcing people to look for jobs that don't exist. We're getting a lot of propaganda in Australia at the moment about, employers can't find people to fill jobs. Well, there might be a slight problem with high school graduates that aren't that interested for cultural reasons looking for work, which is a problem. But look at the people who've lost their jobs, their real jobs, such as in the car industry over the past 20 years and other industries in Australia, who had skills in one area and cannot find new work. They're the ones who, the job's just not there. Look, for example, at, if you take one case, Western Australia, the so-called boom state of Australia, because of mining, which is what everyone highlights, the boom state is technically in recession. Then the one area that's producing is actually looting the country by taking that as cheap exports to China. And so this is a fraud. This whole picture is a fraud. All it's going to do is free up government funds that can become more money to bail out banks, which is what the government is heavily committed to doing. So, Craig, what's the difference between Gillard and the Labor patriots who actually built Australia?
Oh, it's enormous, Robbie. Absolutely enormous. Because look, early Labor understood the role of governments wasn't to lick the boots of British bankers, which is what the Gillard government does now.
The money power.
The money power, as the old Labor Party referred to it. The old Labor members, people like going back Anstey, King O'Malley, coming forward to Kurt Chifley and others, they knew that, and they had a compassion for human beings. They had a compassion for the population because they knew their job was to represent the general welfare. And we've written a lot about how they thought in our Republican pamphlet, which we've got for people to get a hold of. A lot of people don't understand how bad Julia Gillard is because they don't understand history. They don't understand what the Fabian Society actually was. And it's a matter of history that the Fabian Society didn't come into Australia until basically old Labor was out of the road, like 1947, right? Well, it was prior to that period that you really did have the influence of the old Labor policies of nation building, of fighting the banks in this country. Prior to that, after that, it died. I'd say that Ben Chifley was the last, and of course he was around to till the early 50s.
And of course, old Labor was inspired by the American principles, whereas the Fabians are purely British.
Purely British, purely established, as I said a couple of shows ago, it was established to destroy the optimism that come out of Lincoln's policies of adopting what we call the American system of political economy, where he actually created the credit necessary to, first of all, get the bankrupt states that had been fighting the war out of bankruptcy, but then turn the whole economy around by large infrastructure development, and that was the transcontinental railroad. That method of physical economy was copied all around the world. Japan, Germany, Russia, and so forth created an enormous burst of optimism, which was shown up in the Great Centennial Exhibition. I think it was 1876, where millions of people came from around the world to look at this marvel of what the US had done. And see, that's where you see another fraud in all this discussion that's coming up with the budget on both sides of politics, where they start to talk about infrastructure. Now, Australians historically have seen the Snowy Mountain scheme. It's part of in a sense, the cultural heritage almost of people, where young people were brought to the Snowy Mountains by their grandparents to show them what amazing sorts of things that Australians could do. It was a model for bringing in immigrants, hundreds of thousands of immigrants that were brought into our country, and today have got, generations of people now assimilated into our country. How they were brought to do a great project. See, the way you have to look at this discussion about developing the country is how are we going to develop the minds of our people? If we stay where we are now, we are finished. If we don't develop what's called a new platform, that is a new way of thinking, and funding new creative developments into science and technology. And in our particular case, that means we need to look at this issue of nuclear power, as we have the country's one of the world's largest reserves of thorium. In fact, we have the most thorium in the world in terms of reserves, and we have, I think, the third largest reserves of uranium. Yet we're not doing anything about it, right? So when you hear this debate, this garbage debate about infrastructure, it's all using old technologies, whereas our real wealth has to be thinking forward. Okay, let's establish this new industry. Let's establish a space industry, right?
Isn't the NBN the Snowy Mountain scheme of the 21st century?
Even NBN is old technology, right? So, the fact is it doesn't feed the physical economy. You can't eat it. You can't move trucks on it. You can move information around on it, but even that information is dubious, right? It's something that would come 10 or 15 years after you have a decent space industry or a decent high-speed rail system to break down the tyranny of distance in the country. But when our politicians talk about infrastructure, like, for example, Julia Gillard, someone that's committed to reducing Australia's population, you're not going to get projects that are going to open up our country, create new cities, get new water projects, is because they don't want people. And it's the same with Tony Abbott. The way that he goes on about infrastructure as well, it's the same disease, it's the same problem.
Thanks, Craig. So that's it for today's weekly report. We've covered a few subjects here, such as this science picture around earthquakes, plus important, Craig referenced the history work that the CEC has done. You can find more information on that on our website. For the history, you look for the New Citizen Archive on the website, on the CEC website, and we'll post as much of this science information as we can. So I urge you to go to the website and stay abreast of that. Also, I urge you, remember, this is not an information service. The CEC is leading a fight here to address these issues politically in this country and around the world. We need your support. The best way you can do that is subscribe to our publications and get involved. So get in touch with us that way on our website or call our toll-free number 1-800-636-432. And otherwise, stay in touch through this service for more updates. Thank you.